In the last episode, we talked about how to look at your analytics, how to look at your podcast data to find out exactly what your listeners want from you. And we talked about how if you're not seeing any standout episodes and you're not seeing any episodes jump out as being ones that listeners were really attracted to, that one of the reasons could be that you're not being specific enough. And because of that, your content is blending in. So in this episode, I'm going to walk you through the 3 things you need to do to make your content more specific so that you can get more listeners choosing your show over others. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 Hosts Doing. And it's a big mistake, is that they're not being specific enough in the content that they share. They're not being specific with their podcast name. They're not being specific in their description. They're not being specific in their episode titles. And they're not being specific in the episode content itself. Now, most hosts don't realize that they're not being specific enough. In fact, they don't even know the role that specificity plays in attracting new listeners to the podcast. And because of this, it creates a lot of problems for them because it halts the growth of the podcast and it causes their show to blend in. It causes a potential listener to look at your show and be like, this might not be for me. And this is an unconscious decision that happens in a split second. And if you lose that listener once, you've lost them forever. The even bigger problem here is that a lot of hosts are defaulting to AI tools to help come up with descriptive podcast content, descriptive titles, descriptive show notes, which is making them blend in even more. Because think about it. If AI is essentially the sum total of human wisdom, then anything that AI regurgitates, no matter what GPT you use, no matter what input you tell it, no matter how customized you try to make it, is essentially a regurgitation of something that's been said before. And if it's a regurgitation, then guess what? It's not helping you stand out. It's actually increasing the likelihood that you will blend in, even if you put your human spin on the outputs. I'll never forget, I had a client that came to us with all of her episode titles for her podcast launch ready to roll. And she's like, here's my episode titles. And she posted them in our Facebook community. And she was like, can you take a look at these and let me know if these are good to go? And I could immediately tell that they were ChatGPT outputs. Number one, because ChatGPT is going to use this really weird title format. And if you've ever used ChatGPT for your titles, you will see this, where it literally says XYZ, and then there's a colon, and then something, something, something. And usually the titles are so vague, they're so general, the colon makes it really hard to read. Like, who uses colons in writing? Maybe if you are a professor or you've got a PhD, yeah, sure, you might be using some colons and semicolons in your writing. But for the average person who's reading and who's consuming information today at such a fast rate, we're not using fancy punctuation. And so doing things like this actually cause your listener to tune you out. It causes your listener to overlook things because their brain has to think too hard to process it. So the hosts that stand out are the ones who know how to grab listener attention through the way that they communicate in 3 primary aspects of their podcast: verbal, written, and visual. Verbal being what the listener hears, written being what the listener reads, and visual being what the listener sees. So highly effective podcast content isn't about how good your content is or how valuable your content is inside your episodes. It's about how good you are as the host at selling someone, quote unquote, selling someone on why they should listen to the content inside your episodes. Why is the content inside your episodes worth their time? Which is why if you want listeners to binge your podcast and you want new listeners to flock to your podcast, you got to learn how to get hyper specific with your content. Now, the good news is there's 3 easy ways to make something more specific. The bad news is this is not going to be as effective as it could be if you don't have your podcast messaging dialed in. And by that, I mean if you are not clear on the exact problems that you solve for your listener. And we've spent a lot of episodes talking about that, and I'll link to some of them for you in the show notes. But here are the 3 ways that you can make something more specific. Number 1 is to use numbers. Number 2 is to turn what I call feeling words into verbal pictures. And number 3 is to say what your listener is thinking. So let's break down the use of numbers. Why does this matter? There's a difference between saying something like, this will help you grow your podcast, versus 3 under the radar ways that you can get 30 new listeners to your podcast today. Which one does your brain naturally gravitate to? So one of the things we see a lot of people doing is using really vague language when they're describing what problem they solve, where they're using really vague language in their episode titles, they're using really vague language in their show notes and in the episode content itself. So one of the things that you can quickly do, and let's just look at this from the standpoint of your podcast titles, because while we want to apply language patterns like these throughout your podcast, for the sake of specificity, see what I did there, let's look at your episode titles. Skim the last 10 episode titles. How specific are they? Are you using numbers in any of them? Sometimes people will come to us and they'll say, oh, well, my ideal listener is someone who they work a lot. They work a lot. They work all the time. I'm like, well, how much is all the time? Are they working 40 hours a week? Are they working 80 hours a week? Are they working nights? Is it weekends? How much? How many? How often? How long? These are some of the questions that you can begin to ask yourself that you can start creating more specificity around the way you're communicating what you're communicating. The next thing you could do is turn feeling words into verbal pictures. Feeling words are words like stress and worry and anxiety and frustration and happiness and joy. And a great question to ask yourself whenever you see one of those words pop up, whether it be in your episode titles or your show notes or wherever, is how would I describe that if I couldn't use that word? How would you describe overwhelm if you couldn't use the word overwhelm? Why? Because overwhelm for a parent of toddlers who are ages 2 to 4 is going to look completely different than overwhelm for a business owner trying to hit 7 figures in revenue. So when we use words, and I call them feeling words, like overwhelm or frustration, or you're feeling anxious, or you're feeling worried, or you're feeling stressed, it's subjective. And suddenly it's confusing because it's not specific to a person, but it rather could be an experience that some people might be having. And if they're having that experience, it's going to be different for each one of them. So suddenly we're clouding our language. And we're making it harder for our listener to discern if our show is for them or not. So the third way that we can make something more specific is to simply say what they're thinking. You lay awake at night and wonder, am I a good enough mom? Or you've been told by at least 2 doctors, your metabolism is just slowing down. And these are just some of the principles that we teach our clients in terms of how to communicate what they want to communicate with their podcast, in terms of how to let their listener know, hey, yeah, this show is worth your time. This show is something that you need to listen to. And this show is something that might be worth you dropping your time right now to listen to. And we help them create this sense of urgency around what it is that they're putting out there so that listeners not only are compelled to listen, but they're compelled to listen now and they're compelled to come back for more. But like I said earlier, lack of specificity can affect many areas of your podcast. And I want to zoom in specifically on episode titles for just a moment to show you what a difference this can make. Because there's a really fun experiment that I always do inside of our live workshops that no matter how many times I have run this experiment, it fascinates everyone in the room. And what I do is I give examples of episode titles on a screen, and I don't add a lot of context. I tell a little bit about what the episode is about. And I say, this episode could be titled with title A or title B. Tell me which one would you listen to? And again, I've done this experiment countless times, and the result is always the same. The majority of people in the room always pick one specific type of title over another. Because right now, your podcast episode titles are one of the top 3 reasons listeners are overlooking your podcast. Which is why if you want listeners to binge your podcast, you got to learn how to get hyper-specific with your content. And the best place to start is with your episode titles. Because here's the thing. Your podcast episode titles are one of the top 3 reasons listeners are overlooking your podcast. Which is why if you want listeners to flock to your show and to binge your content and to come back every week to listen again, you've got to learn how to get hyper-specific with your content. And the best place, the easiest place that you can start to do this is with your episode titles. Let's say, for example, that you were an online business owner who was struggling to grow on Instagram and you were putting out piece of content after piece of content and reel after reel and carousel after carousel, and you were getting like 2 likes and 4 comments and nobody in the DMs being like, hey, I'd love to work with you. Well, if you were to listen to a podcast episode designed to help you solve this problem, which one of these episodes would you be more likely to listen to? How to make your business stand out on social media? Or 3 reasons your Instagram content keeps getting overlooked? Or let's say that you had a podcast and you were struggling to convert your podcast listeners to leads. Which of these titles would you be more likely to hit play and tune into? 3 easy ways to grow your podcast audience. Or 3 reasons why your podcast listeners aren't converting to leads. Effective titles are one of 5 things that will determine whether or not a listener is going to click play on your show. And what's one of the things that helps make an effective podcast title? specific language. Because effective podcast content isn't about how good your content is inside your episodes. It's about how good you are at selling someone on why they should spend their time listening to the content inside your episodes. And this is why every episode title needs to be problem-focused, and it needs to use hyper-specific language. So we're going to walk through this exercise together, and if you're not at a place where you can do this in real time, that's okay. You can come back to it. But what I want you to do as homework is look back at your last 5 episode titles. And I want you to first and foremost look for some red flags, because these are red flags that you want to avoid at all costs in titling your podcast episodes. The first one is putting episode numbers in the title itself, in the title field itself. Please do not do this. It takes up valuable character space. The podcast players already automatically number your episodes. So it's redundant. There is no need to put it there. And what you're doing is you're just increasing the chances of your podcast title getting cut off on some of the podcast players because you're taking up a few extra spaces, a few extra characters with those episode numbers that really are redundant and irrelevant. The second thing I want you to avoid is using fancy formatting. And by fancy formatting, I mean, please do not copy and paste an output from ChatGPT or any of these other AI tools that use a colon. Okay, delete those colons from your podcast titles, rework those titles. Those colons, we don't naturally write that way. So it's really difficult for the brain to process information that's presented in that way. So we want to avoid that at all costs. We don't want to make your listeners work harder than they need to figure out, is this episode worth my time? Now, the other thing you want to be really mindful of is episode titles that are over 60 characters long. Because on many podcast players, that's the truncation limit. That's where it's going to get cut off. Now, is it going to be possible to get every single episode title under 60 characters? Probably not. But when you can aim for shorter is better and less is more, and how can you say what you want to say and get to the point using less words, the better it will be for your podcast. The other thing that I want you to avoid doing, this is a big red flag, is putting your guest's name first. Why? Because if there is a listener that is scrolling through episodes to listen to, and they're seeing interview after interview and guest name after guest name, and none of these names mean anything to them, we're losing their attention. You need to be able to communicate first what's in it for your listener. And if you have a guest, include their name, but include it at the end of the title. Both you as the host and your guest, who is spending their valuable time coming on your show, wants that episode to be heard. So some people think they're doing their guests a favor by putting their name first because, I'm showcasing my guest and I'm putting my guest first. No, actually, you're doing your guest and your listener a disservice because your listener's tuning that out. They're skimming over those episodes. The guest's name might mean nothing to them, and therefore we lose them. We lose their interest. They'll be less likely to click play than if you had put the problem that you're solving for your listener first, followed by the guest name. Because now it's like, okay, well, I can see why this episode might be worth my time. Let me tune in. And then by the end of that episode, wow, that was one of the most amazing interviews I ever listened to. So you'll be doing your guest and your listener a favor simply by moving the placement of the guest name. So these are the things that I want you to stop doing immediately. And at the beginning of this exercise, I said, looking back at your last 5 episode titles. In fact, I want you to stop doing these red flags for all of your episode titles. I don't care if you have 200 episodes. Go sweep your episode titles and make sure that you've removed all these red flags. Once you've done that, then what we're going to do is we're going to look back at your last 5 episode titles. And what I want you to do is I want you to practice using specific language. If you're noticing any kind of vague language, I want you to replace that with a number. I want you to look for feeling words. Stress and worry and anxiety are ones that pop up all the time. Overwhelm, burnout, we see these all the time. And I want you to notice, where are you using these feeling words? And can you replace that with a more visual, verbal picture that's more descriptive? Also, I want you to make sure, and this is really important, that each episode title is focused on one topic. And that topic needs to be specific. Otherwise, it's going to be too general, and it's not going to stand out to your listener as something that they need to immediately drop everything they're doing to listen to that episode because they want that problem solved. So this is how we can begin to create not only more engagement with our podcast, but also more urgency in the sense of getting listeners more interested in listening, hooking them before they ever hit play. And as you're working through this, if you need some examples, scroll back through this podcast, look at our episode titles, And just for fun, if you want to scroll back to some of the old episodes on this podcast, I want you to notice how less specific those titles were. Part of that was a language problem. Part of it was also a podcast niche problem, which on our show now is dialed in more than it ever has been before. And that's also why coming up in the next episode, I'm going to be answering the question of, do niche podcasts grow faster in this day and age in the podcasting industry? Some people have concerns about this. They're concerned that if they go too narrow or too niche or too specific, they're going to tap out their audience. There's not going to be enough people to support the long-term growth of the show. So in the next episode, I'm going to show you the future of where podcasts are headed and whether your podcast is niche enough to stand out. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.